I never knew a simple repair could feel like walking on the edge of a cliff, but there I was, kneeling under a sputtering fluorescent light in the corner of the bookstore, fumbling with a wobbly shelf that had seen better decades. My hands were sticky with varnish, my shirt smeared with dust, and yet, I couldn't look away from her. She was perched on a tall ladder a few feet away, sorting a stack of new releases. The sunlight caught her hair, turning strands into liquid gold against the muted gray of the shop. Mid-40s, sharp jawline, eyes that had seen the world and weren't afraid to ask uncomfortable questions without words. Confident, yeah, but not the kind that blusters. More the kind that lets you know she'd already made her decision about you, even if you hadn't. "You're making a mess of that," she said, voice even but with the faintest edge, like a warning wrapped in silk. I blinked, trying not to knock over a pile of books with my elbow. I can fix it," I said, maybe a little too quickly, trying to cover for my own fumbling. She leaned against the ladder, arms crossed, one eyebrow quirked. "You sure about that?" Her gaze lingered longer than it should have, and I felt a small spark in my chest, something I couldn't name. There was no flirtation, at least, not yet, but the air between us had weight. The kind that presses lightly, like you're on the verge of saying something you shouldn't, or maybe something you've always wanted to. I nodded, avoiding her eyes for a fraction too long. I like a challenge." She smiled then, just a flicker of a smile, as if she'd heard that same line 1,000 times but was curious if I meant it differently. For a moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes, something soft, almost imperceptible, like regret or amusement or both, and my hands went stiff around the screwdriver. I worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the quiet hum of the heater and the distant chime of the street outside. She watched, not like a boss or a teacher, but like someone holding a mirror up, waiting for me to see myself. At one point, she reached down, almost brushing my shoulder as she handed me a brace for the shelf. I caught it, felt her warmth through the thin cotton of my shirt, and froze. My brain scrambled for words, for something, anything, but all I could do was meet her eyes and nod. "Careful," she murmured, a little softer this time, like she hadn't meant to be heard. The way her voice softened, it wasn't tenderness, exactly. It was intrigue. And just like that, my mind started looping on it, on her, on the tiny rise and fall of her chest, the way she tilted her head slightly, the way her lips pressed together when she was thinking. I finished fixing the shelf, but didn't move. I couldn't. I wanted what exactly? To say something, to ask something, but any words I tried felt cheap. Instead, I just looked at her, memorizing the tilt of her hair, the steady confidence in her posture, the way she carried herself like she was untouchable, and yet somehow, inviting me to try. She shifted, climbed down the ladder, and gave me a single nod. Nothing more, but it was enough. I stood there, heart still thudding, hands sticky, and realized I couldn't stop thinking about the way her voice had softened, about that almost smile that had been a dare in disguise. And I knew, somewhere deep in my chest, that I'd spend the rest of the day replaying that moment, wondering if I could really handle her. The next day, I found myself back in the bookstore, not because I had any real reason to be there, but because I knew she'd be here. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows, dust motes floating lazily in the beams, and the smell of old paper and coffee hit me like a familiar chord. She was behind the counter, sorting through invoices, shoulders tight, jaw set. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping and brushing her temples. She didn't look up when I entered, just a subtle tilt of her head in acknowledgement. I slid a toolbox onto the counter and gave a small, careful smile. "You're back," she said, voice neutral, but there was something underneath it I couldn't quite read. Guarded, cautious. "Thought I'd make sure that shelf really stays fixed," I said, trying to keep my tone light, casual. But even as I spoke, I noticed her hands, the way her fingers lingered on the invoices, how the skin over her knuckles was tight, maybe from stress. Small details, I realized, like how she always tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was focused. She sighed softly, rubbing the back of her neck. "It's been a long morning," she admitted, almost reluctantly. Vulnerability slipped through in that one word. I didn't move to say anything immediately, just let her feel it. Let myself feel it, too. The quiet pull of her energy, the way it demanded attention even when she tried to hide it. I worked in silence beside her, organizing a few returned books onto the correct shelves. I noticed her laugh when a customer asked a dumb question, a short, almost embarrassed sound, like she didn't usually allow herself to enjoy humor openly. And when she paused, rubbing at her eyes, I realized she hadn't slept well. Lines beneath her eyes were faint, but there. Need some water? I offered, holding out a bottle. She hesitated, glanced at me, then accepted it with a nod. That pause, the briefest acknowledgement of trust, felt heavier than words. We worked side by side, the silence stretching comfortably, charged in a way I couldn't explain. I could feel her energy, tightly controlled, always measuring, always watching. And I felt mine in response, tense, observant, pulled into her orbit without permission. When she finally looked at me, it was a flicker of softness, almost imperceptible. Our eyes met and held longer than normal, and I could swear I saw a question there, buried beneath the layers she usually kept locked away. I didn't answer, because there was nothing to say, just the quiet acknowledgement of each other, the awareness that this space we shared was dangerous, exhilarating, and forbidden in its own slow, subtle way. She adjusted a stack of books, fingers brushing mine for a second longer than necessary. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my hand linger at the edge, letting the small contact speak for me. Then she cleared her throat, glanced down, and murmured something I almost didn't hear. Careful, you're persistent. I smiled faintly, letting the words sink in. She didn't laugh, didn't look up immediately, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the pulse of curiosity, maybe even a trace of something unspoken that left my chest tight. And as I returned to my work, organizing the shelves, I realized I wouldn't stop thinking about that moment. The way her guarded exterior had slipped, if only just enough for me to see it. The air between us was charged, quiet, forbidden, and utterly magnetic. The storm started just as I was locking the back door of the bookstore. Rain lashed against the tall windows and sheets, the rhythm sharp and insistent, echoing through the quiet aisles. She was still at the counter, cataloging the day's receipts, her brow furrowed in concentration, hair damp from the humid air. I stepped closer, silently, carrying a box of returned books. My fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second as I passed it to her. She didn't pull away. That single, electric contact was enough to make my chest tighten, a tiny jolt that screamed, "Don't let this go unnoticed." We worked side by side in the muted light, the storm outside amplifying the quiet between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I let my eyes wander over her features, the faint crease near her eyes when she concentrated, the slight tilt of her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together when she was thinking. I noticed everything, because I couldn't stop myself. She laughed softly at a thought she whispered under her breath. It wasn't meant for me, probably, but I caught it anyway. And for a second, I felt as if the space between us had shrunk. I thought about leaning closer, letting my shoulder brush hers, letting my fingers linger on hers just a moment longer. But before I could, her phone buzzed across the counter. She picked it up, eyes narrowing. "It's him," she murmured, and I knew immediately it was her ex, someone I wasn't supposed to be competing with, someone whose presence was a reminder that she had a life before me. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. I caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the way she shifted, as if deciding what to reveal and what to keep hidden. I stayed still, pretending to focus on stacking books, but my mind was elsewhere. My hands felt heavier than they were, my chest tight. I wanted to say, "Wait, stay," but the words were trapped inside. Instead, I let her have this moment, silent and careful, and watched her expression soften when she finally ignored the call and tucked the phone back into her pocket. The air between us felt charged, stretched thin by the storm and the small, unspoken tensions that hovered like electricity. I considered saying something, about us, about the way this feels, but a glance toward the exit reminded me. Someone could walk in at any moment. A friend, a colleague, anyone. The world was always pressing in, reminding me I couldn't just reach across this line. Yet there we were, in the dim light, shoulder to shoulder, hands brushing in tiny, fleeting ways. Her gaze flicked toward mine, and in it, I thought I saw a question, a challenge, maybe even a spark. My pulse throbbed with it, and I realized how badly I wanted to close that small distance between us. I wanted to lean in, wanted to whisper the words that had been pressing in my chest for days. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I froze, half in hesitation, half in restraint, letting the moment hang like a suspended note, heavy and impossible to ignore. And as the rain hammered harder against the glass, I caught myself imagining what it would feel like if I just leaned closer, if I let the storm outside mirror the storm between us. The shop was quieter than usual, the afternoon sun fading into a pale gray that seeped through the high windows. She was perched on the ladder again, rearranging a row of hardcovers, and I was on the floor beneath her, cataloging the lower shelves. The silence between us had stretched so long it almost became a presence of its own. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words kept getting caught in my throat. Every glance toward her felt like crossing an invisible line I wasn't allowed to touch. And then she paused, mid-movement, as if the weight of the day had suddenly struck her. "Why are we like this?" she asked finally, voice quiet but sharp in the stillness. She didn't look at me, eyes fixed on the books in front of her, but I felt the tension radiating from her. I swallowed, fingers tightening on the ledger in my hands. "Like what?" I asked, careful, knowing any answer could tip the balance. She let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "You know, this whatever this is. You come back. I let you linger here. We touch, accidentally. Or not so accidentally. And I don't say anything. And neither do you." Her words were measured, deliberate, but her shoulders slumped in a way that revealed the exhaustion behind the control. I wanted to reach out, to say I don't know either, but even that felt inadequate. I like being here. With you. I trailed off, because the truth was too big for speech. Too raw. She finally looked at me then, and the expression in her eyes made my chest constrict. No teasing, no challenge, just something heavy, fragile, real. "Do you ever wonder if we're just pretending we're fine?" I did. Every day. Every time our hands brushed. Every time she smiled. Every time she let me stay just a second too long in her orbit. But saying it aloud felt like admitting something that could destroy the delicate balance. So I stayed silent, letting my gaze hold hers instead, hoping it said more than words ever could. She took a slow breath, the kind that shudders through the chest. I can't keep doing this if we don't at least say what it is," she whispered. Her voice broke on the last words, a crack in the armor she'd been so careful to wear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The truth of what she'd just said hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I felt it press against my ribs, heavy and urgent. She stepped down from the ladder, moving closer, not touching, not yet, but close enough that I could see every line in her face, every flicker of doubt and exhaustion. And then, as if the weight of holding it in had finally broken her, she let her head tilt slightly and whispered something that made my stomach lurch. "I don't even know if I want this, but I don't know how to stop either." The words fell between us like stones in a still pond. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I could only stand there, letting her vulnerability sink in, and realize, quietly, terrifyingly, that nothing would ever feel the same again. I found her in the back corner of the bookstore, hunched over a small wooden desk tucked between stacks of unsorted novels. A single lamp threw a warm circle of light across her face, illuminating the faint lines around her eyes that the daylight always seemed to hide. She didn't hear me approach. "Hey," I said softly, trying not to startle her. She looked up, startled, and for a moment her usual composure faltered. "Oh, it's just you," she murmured, voice low, a touch weary. I stepped closer, noticing the crumpled envelope in her hands. It wasn't the usual invoices or book returns. Something about the way she held it, like it was heavier than it should be, made me pause. "What is it?" I asked gently, and she hesitated, glancing at me with a flicker of something I hadn't seen before. Hesitation, maybe shame, maybe fear. "It's from him," she said finally, voice tight. Her fingers trembled around the paper. I didn't even think I'd kept it. She shook her head, half smile, half sadness. "I thought I'd moved on. But sometimes, something like this, it hits you again." I nodded, letting her words sink in. "I get it," I said quietly. "I mean, losing someone like that, it doesn't just vanish. You carry it, whether you want to or not." She looked at me then, really looked, as if testing me, trying to gauge whether I understood the depth of her unspoken ache. "I thought I was okay," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle it. And then I read this letter again, and," she trailed off, jaw tight, eyes glimmering with old pain. I wanted to reach for her hand, to offer some kind of steadying touch, but I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch, letting her emotions breathe in the small space between us. Her vulnerability, unpolished and raw, struck me harder than I expected. "You don't have to hide it," I said gently. "Not with me. I'm not going anywhere." She shook her head slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and for a moment her walls slipped enough for me to see the girl she used to be, the one who had loved and lost, who had learned to guard herself fiercely. I realized how much courage it took just to let me stand there, quietly, while she faced this ghost from her past. Then she opened the letter slowly, almost reluctantly, and I caught a few words before she folded it back up. "I'll always love you." Her shoulders sagged. The words didn't bring a smile or bitterness, just a quiet, heavy ache that seemed to pull the air from the room. I stepped a little closer, careful not to intrude, and said, "We can't rewrite the past. But maybe it doesn't have to decide what comes next." She met my eyes, a tremor of something fragile and raw flickering across her gaze. I don't know if I'm ready for what's next," she whispered. Her lips pressed together, eyes flicking down to the envelope one last time. And then, almost imperceptibly, she let her hand brush mine. Not intentionally, maybe, but it lingered long enough to send a quiet jolt through me. A small, almost accidental moment, but it felt seismic, as if the room had shifted without either of us moving. I stood there, letting the electricity settle between us, knowing this moment had changed something irreversibly. The bookstore was empty that evening, the last customers gone, and the overhead lights dimmed to a soft, warm glow. The rain from earlier had cleared, leaving the streets glistening, reflections rippling in puddles outside. She was sitting on the edge of the counter, legs crossed, arms wrapped loosely around herself, and I was on the floor, organizing the bottom shelves. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, familiar, and filled with the weight of all the words we'd left unsaid. I watched her fingers trace the edge of a book, small movements that somehow seemed to carry all the confessions we couldn't voice. "I never thought I'd let anyone stay," she said finally, her voice low, thoughtful. Not a declaration, just an acknowledgement, like she was telling herself as much as me. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and for the first time, the distance between us didn't feel like a gap. It felt like an opening. "I'm not going anywhere," I replied, voice quiet, steady, letting her hear the certainty I felt even if the words were few. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing, if only slightly. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic flourish. Just two people, breathing in the same space, learning to accept what had already been growing between them. I moved closer, careful, and rested my hand near hers on the counter. It hovered, then brushed hers lightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let it rest, a tiny, deliberate contact that spoke louder than anything we could have said. The brush of skin against skin was gentle, electric, affirming, the first seal on what had been building quietly between us. We stayed that way, side by side, letting the soft glow of the bookstore wrap around us, letting the hum of the city outside fade into nothing. The world could wait. The storm, the past, the letters, the uncertainty, All of it had led here, to this moment of stillness and recognition. I, I can handle this, she murmured, almost to herself. Not a promise, not a plea, just the truth, careful, fragile, spoken into the quiet room. I nodded, smiling faintly, letting the relief settle in my chest. I didn't need her to say more. I didn't need a grand confession. The way she let me sit here, the way she allowed the brush of our hands, the way her shoulders relaxed slightly against the counter, it was enough. For the first time, the slow-burning tension between us felt inevitable, earned. It wasn't reckless, it wasn't sudden, it was patient, fragile, human. And in the quiet, I realized that this small, shared understanding, this tiny act of trust, was all we needed to tip the balance. I let my forehead rest lightly against hers for a second, almost imperceptibly, and she leaned into it, closing her eyes. No words, no declarations, just presence. And in that soft, unspoken agreement, the world outside ceased to matter. We stayed there, sitting together in silence, letting the quiet confirm everything that had been building between us. No fireworks, no final statements, just the gentle, undeniable truth that we belonged here, together, for this moment, and maybe more. It's been weeks since that evening in the bookstore, the one where silence spoke louder than anything we could have said. I still catch myself replaying the moments, the small gestures, the way her hand lingered near mine as if testing the waters, or the soft tilt of her head when I leaned in just enough to rest my forehead lightly against hers. Things aren't perfect. Life hasn't slowed down, and the past still lingers in little ways. The unopened letters, the occasional ache of old heartbreaks. But something between us shifted, quietly, irreversibly. She moves through the bookstore with the same confident grace, but there's a softness there now, a willingness to let someone in, even if just a little. And me? I've learned patience. I've learned how to sit in a quiet room, heart pounding, and not rush towards something just because I want it. I've learned that love isn't just about bold gestures or grand confessions. It's about being present, noticing the tiny details, and letting someone feel seen without pressure, without expectation. We found a rhythm together that isn't loud or obvious. It's in shared coffee breaks, in brushing dust off the same shelf, in laughter that's quieter now, but somehow more genuine. It's in the way she trusts me with small parts of herself, and in the way I've learned to respect her space while quietly cherishing the moments she offers. I still remember that first spark, the hesitation, the stolen glances, the quiet electricity of hands brushing almost accidentally. And I see now that every awkward pause, every stormy night, every near confession led us here. It wasn't easy, it wasn't neat, but it was ours. Sometimes, when the shop is empty and the city hums softly outside, we just sit together, letting the quiet confirm what we already know. And there's no need for grand words. The presence is enough. The understanding is enough. I think that's what love is, really. Not the movies, not the cliches, but the patient accumulation of moments, small and human, until suddenly, it feels inevitable. And when you realize that, when you let yourself feel it without forcing it, it changes you. So here we are. Not perfect, not finished, but alive in the same space, quietly learning each other's rhythms, sharing the subtle intimacy of understanding and trust. And I know, somehow, that this soft, earned connection is worth more than anything I've ever known. If you've ever felt a spark that's too quiet to name, too fragile to claim, I hope you'll remember, sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones that change everything. What would you have done if you were in my place?